It is now my pleasure to introduce David James Hudson. Dave is an award-winning writer, a library and information studies scholar, and an associate librarian at the University of Guelph. His creative and scholarly work is primarily concerned with race, racism, and anti-racism, especially creative and scholarly, especially the ways in which these phenomena have come to be conceptualized both historically and in the present day, and the interests of such conceptualizations have served. He explores such questions with particular attention to contexts of library information work, Black diasporic life, colonialism, and capitalism. His writings appeared in such publications as Uproot, the Journal of Critical Library and Information Studies, the Journal of Information Ethics, and the edited collections Topographies of Whiteness and Information Ethics and Global Citizenship. It is my pleasure to welcome David James Hudson to kick off our 2023 Critical Pedagogy Symposium. Dave's talk is going to last for about an hour or so, and so it really would be easiest if you'd save your questions for the end. We don't want them to get lost in this backlog of the chat. And with that, I turn this over to Dave. Thank you.
All right. Can I be seen and heard?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks, Liam. And thank you also to Sean, Linda, Symphony, Heba, Leah, Stephanie, Hafiza, Emma, Haley, Diane, Nicole, and I'm sure many other people whose labor has made this symposium possible. I'm grateful for your invitation and for your hosting this space of conversation. I'm also grateful to the many people who provided direct feedback and support on my work in this area. And in particular, I want to name Yoonhee Lee, Salma Abumays, Baharak Yousefi, Ebony Magnus, and Lawrence Maminta, as well as my partner and our spirited 5-year-old. Thank you also to all of you who have come to share space, to listen and perhaps offer your own thoughts wherever you may be joining us from. I'm speaking to you from, as I understand it, the territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Attawandaron, or neutral peoples, and the Anishinaabe, specifically the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as from a place home to people from many other nations and communities. Another name for this place is University of Guelph in Guelph, Ontario, Canada, which is to say that I'm speaking to you from stolen land, which is to say that I'm speaking to you from land reconceived as property and expropriated as such, treated as capital, which is to say that I'm speaking to you from a settler capitalist state and a seat of empire, a site from which local and global projects of colonial violence are launched, relaunched, produced, reproduced, reshaped in ongoing ways. And in my case, today I'm speaking to you from a library, in a life funded by a library, by an institution, by a university, in a place called equivocally home, all inevitably entangled in spite of attempts to distance such structures of colonial violence from seemingly innocuous spaces like these, innocuous spaces like the library, innocuous spaces like the university, innocuous spaces like home. This is also to say, though, that I'm speaking to you from a site at which the land and all our communities of resistance and survival continue to grow in all of their complexity and contradiction, in spite of the best efforts of capital to ensure otherwise. And one way to support this resistance would be to donate to the funds for legal defense, camp costs, and other financial needs associated with the work that Wet'suwet'en land defenders are doing to prevent the fossil fuel company TC Energy from running a pipeline through their territory in the northwest of this continent, a corporate project backed by repeated militarized raids by the Canadian state. I've included links to these sites on this slide, and that those sites are going to offer more information and outline ways to donate. If someone could, tweet those out, add those to the chat, that'd be great. But wherever you are, there are likely other acts of land defense and resistance to colonial violence to which you might contribute, that you might get involved in, that you might support to whatever extent possible. I've also included these links on a companion page that I've put together for this talk with additional notes and resources related to content that I just kind of ended up cutting out or didn't elaborate on as much as I would have liked. So you can find that page at s.id/CPS 2023. And if someone could add that to the chat, that would be appreciated as well. So these specific sorts of settler colonial violence that I've gestured towards are, of course, a part of a larger structure of oppression, of exploitation, dispossession, disposal, and disappearance, animated by racial differentiation and hierarchy, a larger structure that also includes the kinds of overt repression that we're seeing play out in intensified assaults on libraries and schools, right? Assaults on what we teach and learn, what we lend and borrow and read and more, all in the name of countering a manufactured enemy called critical race theory. There's continuity, in other words, between pipelines backed by militarized raids and the removal of books from libraries. However, even though these attacks are the most visible way that something called critical race theory is showing up in the library world, they're not the central focus of my talk today. And that's in part because the assaults on so-called critical race theory are so obviously not about critical race theory, at least not about critical race theory as a specific scholarly tradition that really represents only one of many systematic critiques of race and power. In some senses, this talk is more about an element of the broader context of these attacks, about how we understand and fight the entrenched systems of racial oppression by which non-white communities are consistently and directly targeted, but by which literally everyone but the ruling class is getting fucked over. And let me be clear about that last bit, as is increasingly the case at events about racism, especially those that use the term critical race theory. There's always a chance that there may be those in the audience listening in hopes of confirming the story that CRT, whatever you think that may be, is an attack on freedom, is about special treatment, guilt trips, and so on. So to anyone listening with this in mind, I will say this: the kind of shit we're talking about today, the kinds of histories and processes of racial violence by which some communities are targeted more than others, that's not ultimately about your guilt and privilege. In fact, let's just throw out the concept of white privilege as deeply limited and just kind of annoying. This stuff is rather about whether you're going to let a bunch of billionaires and their minions continue to shape your life and extract your dignity through diversionary stories, right? This stuff is ultimately about the skyrocketing price of food, about how hard it is to make ends meet, about whether your kid has the supports they need to learn, whether your grandma can afford her meds and her dental care, about the heat that just keeps getting hotter and hotter, and about whether we're going to be able to grow the food we need in the future. So that's what's at stake when we're talking about the structures of racism that characterize our society. My talk starts, in a sense, from the recognition that these structures are maintained and reproduced in a variety of ways beyond the direct and open coercion that attacks on libraries and curricula represent. And in particular, that they're also maintained through the management of dissent and through the absorption, pacification, neutralization, in a word, the institutionalization of radical liberation movements, a process by which these stories of radical structural transformation that such movements are telling are appropriated and adapted and put to work instead for the maintenance of the status quo. In a nutshell, both the active encouragement of racial justice talk in institutionally convenient ways and the outright censorship of racial justice talk are part and parcel of the same political project. Now, I've been interested in these types of tactics of absorption and containment for a while, as anyone who's heard me yammer on in the past decade can probably tell you. And there's lots of amazing scholarly and non-scholarly work that documents and analyzes these strategies in different and more detailed ways. And the work amongst this that I think is most relevant as we start a critical pedagogy symposium is Dylan Rodriguez's framing of counterinsurgency as constituting in part a curriculum. So counterinsurgency as a curriculum. So for Rodriguez, counterinsurgency, that is, moves against insurgents, right? Moves against those revolting towards fundamental transformation of the existing social order, right? Moves against insurgents. Counterinsurgency is, again, not just about militarized violence and direct state repression, but also about curriculum, which he defines, to use his words, quote, in the broadest sense, not just as classrooms, but as the way that the world is taught to people, right? So curriculum, not just as classrooms, but as the way that the world is taught to people. So counterinsurgency as a curriculum is thus, in a sense, about responding to the teachings of revolutionary movements through circulating and valorizing alternate versions of those teachings that neutralize their revolutionary potential and their revolutionary vision. And Rodriguez specifically highlights the centrality of liberals and progressives rather than reactionaries in advancing this counterinsurgent curriculum, pointing, for example, to the ways in which Black Lives Matter came to be institutionalized under diversity, equity, and inclusion and other manageable banners in response to the unsettling that was the 2020 uprisings against anti-Black state violence. As it has been for some time, the question from where we stand is how we intervene in these structures of racially animated violence. And in thinking about counterinsurgency and curricula as relevant elements of the political project by which such structures are sustained, we might recognize that it is critical that we think deeply about the anti-racist frameworks we are drawing on, the stories we are telling about racism, anti-racism and racial justice, about our pedagogy and our curricula as such, the sets of teachings we mobilize in support of the anti-racist work we do, and about how we might consciously situate that work in relation to these sorts of counterinsurgent, anti-racist curricula that circulate in service of the ruling class and the status quo. And so we turn to critical race theory, an example of one such set of stories, one broadly defined set of teachings on race and power that folks in the library world have increasingly turned to, especially since 2020. And I should be clear from the outset that I'm not using critical race theory in an all-encompassing way to refer to any and every critical analysis of racialized power relations. I'm being more specific than that. So by critical race theory, which I'll frequently shorten to CRT, I mean the very specific scholarly tradition and body of work built upon the foundational late 20th century work of US legal studies scholars, a vast body of work that coalesces in legal studies and education studies especially, but that extends well beyond these disciplines, and that is politically and intellectually diverse, even as it nonetheless draws to varying degrees on the commonly identified set of core tenets referenced in the introduction, right? Core tenets like racism is ordinary, intersectionality, counter storytelling, and so on. So that's what I mean by critical race theory. And it's this specific critical theoretical framework, and especially its deployment in the library world, that's going to be the focus of my critical attention today. So the turn to CRT within the library is ostensibly driven by a deep frustration with the failures of the liberal racial politics that have dominated our field for decades, a politics mobilized chiefly under the banner of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. It has, of course, been made abundantly clear for some time that these dominant DEI politics are incapable of meaningfully challenging racism as a structural phenomenon, especially its work as such in and through the library world. And the central critique that the LIS critical race theory literature brings to these dominant DEI regimes is that they are superficial, disingenuous, and politically timid, that they fail to name race and white supremacy explicitly or in any real detail, that they lack commitment and follow-through, and that they just don't really work, right? They are top-down, one-dimensional, inauthentic, anemic and ineffective, and watered down, to use descriptions from the literature. In a nutshell, the argument is that DEI, as the dominant racial politics of the library world, operates more or less as a corporate branding exercise, that intentionally or not, it does not bring about and cannot serve as a vehicle for bringing about the very diversity, equity, and inclusion it speaks of. And the critiques are often sort of encapsulated in the word performative, right? So in contrast to the dominant politics of DEI, a critical race theory is situated in the library literature as a more substantial framework for reckoning with the systems of racialized oppression in and through the library world. CRT is situated as allowing LIS scholars to more effectively account for, unpack, and challenge the sheer extent and complex operations of such systems of violence. One text, for instance, describes CRT as a means of achieving structural justice in LIS, as a methodology that enables broad and deep systemic rather than individual change, and that therefore serves as a basis for moves towards liberation. In short, the turn to CRT is taken to be a radical departure from the failed liberal anti-racist politics that have dominated LAS, and taken to represent a methodological basis for meaningful challenges to the operations of racialized oppression in and through libraries. It's this latter claim, then, that claim that CRT represents a break from the status quo, that I'm in a sense going to be focusing my critical attention on today. In the Conclusion to Knowledge Justice, their groundbreaking edited collection on critical race theory in LAS, Leung and Lopez-McKnight point to the need to engage critically with CRT, rather than taking it to be self-evident and unquestionable, which indeed underscores the importance of engaging rigorously and critically as a community with any framework we use. With this in mind, then, what I'm going to be doing today is providing a critical, and the hope is generative reading and assessment of the politics of critical race theory, particularly as it has come to be deployed in the library world. And what I want to argue is that even as it brings with it important attentions to the failings of conventional DEI regimes, and even as it brings with it important attention to some of the complex dynamics of white supremacy in libraries, the literature of CRT in LIS has nonetheless far too often appeared to function not as a radical break from the dominant liberal anti-racist politics of our field, but as an extension of those politics, as a space through which their core teachings are reproduced. Given the questions that have tended to be asked within the literature, as well as those that have tended to be absent, critical race theory is indeed easily enfolded into and circulated within the counterinsurgent curriculum that liberal anti-racism represents, easily put to work in service, ultimately, of the operations of the library as such, as an institution in and through which structures of racialized oppression are reproduced. And as an aside, when I say the library as such, I don't mean the very idea of a library or the many daily practices of libraries as wonderful hubs of community activity, learning, lending, borrowing, contemplation, respite, and so on, right? The library as such refers to the library as it currently exists. That is, as an institution that is inevitably bound up in the social order of which it is a part, and has been set up to reproduce that social order, whether it be through its participation in particular regimes of labor, its entanglement in financial markets, its investment in certain ideas about what constitutes legitimate knowledge, and so on. And we could talk about all that more, but still, get yourself a library card if you don't have one, and if you can, right? I should also stress that where the CRT literature in LIS is concerned, my aim in offering this critical attention is not to call out any particular text or group of texts, any author or group of authors. I'm not here to play gotcha with any text for not using the right or radical enough language, when indeed focusing on individual texts and their flaws as an end in itself would ultimately be ridiculous and counterproductive. Ultimately, it's a good thing that folks are giving sustained attention from wherever they are to the complex ways in which racialized power dynamics structure our lives. And my assumption is that many of us are responding to the same kinds of observations, experiences, and urges. At the same time, I take all these writings and all these talks we do to be attempts to work through stuff, right? Always already incomplete and imperfect in themselves. And for this very reason, we need to be able to push ourselves collectively beyond taken for granted and other comfortable spaces. And in particular, we need to be able to engage in serious, detailed, and sustained debate and conversation about our assumptions and about the limits, affordances, and complicities of the stories, like critical race theory, that we're calling on to guide us, lest our work be minimized, dismissed, institutionalized, neutralized. So at stake, in other words, is the enclosure and domestication of desires for radical transformation. And so as we kick off a couple of days of critical conversation about the work that CRT might be put to in our field, the question I'd invite us to ask is this: okay? What is the political project of critical race theory? Okay? So after all, as is emphasized repeatedly in the library literature, critical race theory consciously rejects facades of political neutrality and focuses centrally and explicitly on justice and transformation. So what is the political project of critical race theory? That is, what kind of transformation in systems of racialized power relations does it seek to achieve? This question is admittedly hard to answer because, as I've suggested, the body of work that's done under the banner of critical race theory is so vast and so varied. And so perhaps the question to ask is not what is the political project of CRT, but even though there has been compelling scholarly discussion on this very question, I don't feel well equipped to answer it in any substantive or extended way. So perhaps the more useful question for today is this: what is the political project, that you are attaching to your work with CRT? What is the political project that you are attaching to your work with CRT? Right? If the common starting point for LIS work with critical race theory is the problematization of race and power in our field with a view to some sort of broad transformation, what is your vision of that transformation? What is the vision of racial justice, the ask, the demand? Is it meaningful and genuine equity within a space? Is it just racial heterogeneity within a space? Is it the complete dismantling and transformation of that space as it currently exists? And of course, there are all sorts of other questions that come along with this. How are you conceiving of the problem in the first place? That is, what specifically makes racialized power relations a problem in the library world? Why does it persist as a problem both in the library world and in the broader world within which our field exists? And likewise, how are you conceiving of anti-racism? How are you conceiving of work towards racial justice? It may seem that the answers to some of these questions are obvious. I'd argue, however, that this stems from the common assumption that racial justice is self-evident. But I suggest that even if we limit our conversation to those of us who engage with these things sincerely and explicitly, there are still vast and critical differences between the stories of racism and racial justice that circulate in and through our field and the interests that these stories serve. Again, what is the political project to which you're attaching your work with CRT, consciously or not, purposefully or not? What is the political project of CRT and libraries that your work is contributed to? These are the questions that I think we really need to be asking ourselves. So here's how I'm going to proceed for the rest of this talk. Since I'm going to be focusing on the politics of specific assumptions about racial oppression and liberation, I'll start by being upfront about my own set of assumptions on these matters, which draws not so much on critical race theory as it does on what we might call a racial capitalism framework. After that, I'll highlight those assumptions about racism and anti-racism that underpin the dominant liberal racial politics that governs our society. I'll then turn to looking at the specific ways in which critical race theory more broadly remains conceptually compatible with the very structures of racial oppression whose violence it critiques, and the ways in which these unfortunate dynamics have tended to be reproduced in the use of CRT in our field specifically. And then I'll end with some brief reflections and questions on how we might proceed as a community interested in ongoing self-criticality as it relates to the politics of the intellectual work we do. So even though I have in the past been among those who use the phrase critical race in a sort of sloppy and all-encompassing way, I don't actually frame my work as critical race theory anymore, nor do I find myself turning to CRT as my primary lens of analysis. The core assumptions about racial oppression and liberation that I'm working with are informed rather by the concept of racial capitalism and its surrounding conversations. Now, people use the concept of racial capitalism in a bunch of different ways, so I should be clear about the kind of framing I'm drawing on, right? So I'm not using racial capitalism in the sense that, for example, legal scholar Nancy Leong does, for whom the term just kind of refers to the strategic use of non-white identities as a means of generating profit. Nor am I using racial capitalism to refer to racist business practices more broadly, or to highlight a particularly racist version of capitalism, which would suggest that there's some non-racist version of capitalism out there. Rather, I'm using the term to recognize, as has been said many times by folks working with this concept, that all capitalism is racial capitalism, that all capitalism is racial capitalism. As a structural feature of the contemporary world, white supremacist violence and hierarchy is both a function of and a driving force in the reproduction of the capitalist political and economic arrangements by which our lives are governed. Now, to be clear, this is not about saying that class is the only relevant formation worth talking about, nor is it about saying that centering discussions of racism works to divide the working class. That's not what I'm saying at all. Rather, it's about recognizing that racism as a structural phenomenon operates as an integral element of the exploitative and expropriative violence by which the capitalist global order reproduces itself. It's about recognizing that racism as a structural phenomenon operates as a central and sustaining feature of a system by which a small group of people accumulates and claims control over land, humans and non-humans alike, and other phenomena, and calls that control wealth and property. Again, all capitalism is racial capitalism. To paraphrase Ruth Wilson Gilmore and others, capitalism requires differentiation and hierarchy among populations, and racism enshrines these. Racism is an organizing structure upon which the exploitation, dispossession, disposal, and disappearance at the heart of capitalism depends. So far from minimizing race as a relevant category of analysis, the concept of racial capitalism allows us to actually center it, to situate and interrogate the disproportionate violence visited upon the lives of non-white communities, whether this be the violence of the border, the ongoing pandemic, the prison of imperial wars, climate catastrophe, and the destruction of land in the name of so-called development, or the daily indignities of media landscapes and toxic workplaces. Right? The concept of racial capitalism allows us to situate and interrogate these practices of racialized violence as truly structural. That is not simply as widespread, and not simply as long-standing, not simply even as the outcome of some vague and timeless thing called whiteness, right? But as built-in, as inevitable and foundational elements of the capitalist social, political, and economic arrangements that govern our lives. Racial capitalism, in other words, offers us a framework not simply for pointing to and describing racism, but for explaining its persistence. Now, this doesn't mean that the destruction of capitalism automatically brings about the end of racism. It means rather that the fight against racial oppression has to be central to the fight against the capitalist violence that ultimately degrades all our lives in material ways, if at differing speeds. But it also means that anti-racist politics, any anti-racist politics that is not oriented explicitly or not towards the destruction of capitalism, is at best incomplete. And this in turn forms the basis of a coalition built not on endless statements of positionality, claims of allyship, and confessions of privilege, but the recognition that the predator class is coming for all of us, and that attention needs to be given and lessons need to be learned where we are being targeted first and most directly. So that is the set of teachings on racism, anti-racism, and racial justice that informs my work. And even if they haven't always featured the actual phrase racial capitalism, these are among the teachings that have historically proved most threatening to the ruling class in Western capitalist nation states. By contrast, the counterinsurgent curriculum through which the ruling class has sought to neutralize these teachings is the liberal racial politics that has come to dominate anti-racist discourse. It's really the story of racism and racial justice that has come to be enshrined as an anti-racist common sense. And again, there's lots of scholarship that looks historically at how liberal racial politics has come to be enshrined as the common sense version of anti-racism since roughly the middle of the last century. Scholarship that highlights specific ways in which the development and circulation of liberal anti-racist teachings in legal, cultural, and educational settings has operated as a containment strategy in response to the threats posed by insurgent racial liberation struggles. Robert Allen's Black Awakening in Capitalist America is one such book that comes to mind, and Jody Malamud's Represent and Destroy is another, and there are many more. But in short, regardless of the intentions of those advancing them, liberal racial politics have to be understood as operating as a counterinsurgent curriculum, as a means by which the racial capitalist social order neutralizes threats to its ongoing existence, and by which it adjusts and resuscitates itself to meet the needs of a given moment, And at the core of this set of liberal anti-racist teachings are logics of inclusion and equity within capitalist society and its institutions, including the library as such. In these teachings, racism is explained primarily as a matter of misguided individual ideas and/or psychology, as a matter of people just thinking wrong, either individually or en masse, within an existing space, whether this be an individual organization like a library, an individual field like LIS, or an individual nation state like the US or Canada. Racial justice, in turn, is explained primarily as racial heterogeneity, inclusivity, and equity within such a space. That is, primarily in terms of the meaningful social and economic recognition, integration, and valuing of racialized communities that have historically been, quote unquote, left out. What is, of course, characteristically missing from liberal anti-racism as such is any meaningful analysis of the relationship between, on the one hand, persistent patterns of racialized violence, and on the other, our society's capitalist political and economic foundations. The move in some has been to conceptually detach racism from capitalism and to relegate racism to the realm of the individual, with anti-racism reduced to the achievement of equity within the institutions and businesses of capitalist society. In this sense, it can be said then that racial capitalism has its own anti-racist curriculum. Racial capitalism has its own anti-racist curriculum within which the circulation of racial liberal politics works, intentionally or not, to teach us about racism and anti-racism in such a way as to foreclose deeper indictment of capitalism, and thus to foreclose the possibility of more fundamental structural transformation, to teach us us that racial liberation is recognition by and integration into the capitalist state, its institution and their terms of order, that the horizon of racial justice is simply reform toward a more racially inclusive and equitable capitalism. Now, before we move on to a discussion of how to make sense of the politics of critical race theory among all this, there is something worth noting here. As a tactic of counterinsurgency, contemporary racial liberal politics may well include an active recognition of racist violence, and as such, they do not simply or even primarily operate by insisting on race neutrality, by denying the existence of racism or the relevance of critical discussions about the category of race. It's indeed worth distinguishing the more encompassing understanding of racial liberalism that I'm invoking here from that which has tended to get circulated in critical race theory, at least CRT in libraries. Within this library literature, racial liberalism tends to get used to refer to the denial of race as a relevant category of analysis. Racial liberalism gets used, in a sense, to name a race-specific version of the libraries are neutral claim. So one LIS text, for example, uses racial liberalism to refer to that feature of library administration that uses appeals to neutral library policy to avoid discussions of racism. Another text uses racial liberalism to refer to the myth that academic publishing standards are objective or meritocratic, that they are disconnected from the racialized dynamics of scholarly knowledge production. And there are many more examples, but the key point is that in the CRT literature in our field, liberal racial politics come to be defined as the claim that libraries are race neutral. So there are a bunch of us talking about and critiquing liberal racial politics, but we're defining it in different ways. We're defining it in different ways. And indeed, a more substantial definition of racial liberalism would recognize that it's about more than a denial of the significance of racialized power relations. Again, in LIS elsewhere, the characteristic problem of liberal racial politics is not only always or even mostly the imperative that we be race neutral, with many advancing a liberal racial politics while actively asserting that race neutrality does not exist, that race is relevant, that racism, indeed that white supremacy exists and ought to be challenged as systemic features of our society. And indeed, this points us to something larger. It would be a mistake to treat critical race theory as a conceptual framework that automatically takes us beyond the liberal racial politics that dominates our field. And we're mistaken, in other words, if we assume that there is something inherent in CRT, that there is something in the questions it asks, the stories it typically tells, and the uses to which it is typically put that necessarily sets its work apart from and enables substantive challenges to the stories about race, racism, and anti-racism by which our field remains fundamentally bound up in racial capitalism. Indeed, on the contrary, it seems to me that both in theory and in practice, CRT is quite easily absorbed into and circulated as part of racial capitalism's own counterinsurgent anti-racist curriculum. Even beyond its frequently limited definition of racial liberalism, there's nothing per se in the oft-cited core tenets of CRT that make them incompatible with racial capitalism. Take, for example, the core tenet that racism is ordinary. Right? Racism is ordinary. A tenet summarized as follows in Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanchik's often cited introduction to CRT. Right? So, quote, racism is ordinary, not aberrational, the usual way society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. Now, I get that there are folks who still need to hear this, lots of folks who still need to hear this, but it has also improved entirely possible for corporations, governments, universities, and so on to integrate proactive acknowledgement of the reality, pervasiveness, and commonness of racism as a means of extending rather than challenging their operations as institutions of racial capitalism. Racism may even be named as systemic, may even be named as structural, but it soon becomes clear that these terms do not bring with them any meaningful analysis of how our society is fundamentally organized in political and economic terms. Systemic simply comes to mean system-wide, a widespread societal pattern of miseducation and misbehavior that results in racially inequitable outcomes. And similarly, structural simply comes to mean that these racially inequitable outcomes are deeply seated and beyond the control of any one institution for some unspecified reason. But there is no move per se to connect such harm to the capitalist political economic relations within which it is deeply seated. No move to consider the persistent centrality of racial differentiation and hierarchy to such relations. And this sort of circumscribed talk of the systemic and the structural has been especially pronounced since the 2020 uprisings, coming from voices like JP Morgan Chase, Walmart, George H.W. Bush, the NFL, and the IMF, to name just a few sites of ruling class power. But again, the main issue here is not disingenuity, right? It's not simply that those describing racism as normal, systemic, structural, and so on are not backing up their words with action, right? The core problem is that the mere recognition of racism as such does not itself represent nor necessarily attached to a project of fundamental transformation, and that such a recognition is easily attached to a political project of reforming and rejuvenating racial capitalism. We might recognize, for example, that racism as a systemic phenomenon in our society is about disproportionate harm experienced by non-white communities, overrepresentation and underrepresentation in conditions of possibility and constraint, life and death. We might, in fact, offer a genuine, detailed account of such disproportionality, and we might then attach it to a project that simply aims to eliminate the disproportionality, to eliminate racial disparity, right? No racial disparity among CEOs of publishing companies and newspaper editors, no racial disparity in police violence, no racial disparity in the precariousness among workers in the capitalist university. The political project here is simply to make these spaces of violence more representative of the population as a whole, more equitable, not to eliminate them or even to reckon with the reason that such disproportionality exists in the first place, the reason it is maintained, the specific interests it serves. And it seems to me that as a framework, CRT is so easily absorbed into these sorts of reformist, liberal, anti-racist project because it has tended to focus primarily on naming and describing the extent and details of racial oppression, on the fact that racial oppression exists, and on what it looks like in practice, and far, far less on meaningfully accounting for why it exists and persists, the capitalist political economic relations that make it possible, that sustain it, and in whose interests it in turn works, right? So CRT's racism as ordinary tenet doesn't get us out of racial liberal territory. And one could point to similar dynamics in relation to other core CRT tenets, whether it be counter-storytelling and voice, intersectionality, or race as a social construct. I'm happy to speak about this more in the Q&A if you'd like. To be clear, though, I'm not arguing that CRT's core tenets inevitably work to reproduce the liberal anti-racist politics upon which racial capitalism depends, right? My argument, rather, is that we are mistaken if we assume that the deployment of these tenets, or indeed the invocation of CRT in general, automatically translates into a radical racial politics, that they automatically transport us beyond and represent substantive challenges to the liberal racial politics through which our field's foundational entanglement with racial capitalism has continued to be reproduced. And my argument, again, is that we need to consider the complex and especially the counterinsurgent dynamics of contemporary racial capitalism, that structures of racial oppression are, again, maintained in no small part through moves to absorb and neutralize radical liberation movements. And we need to consider the ways in which invocations of CRT specifically might, and indeed too often do, work in service of such counterinsurgent political projects, in spite of the best intentions of those doing the work in the first place. And this is unfortunately the sort of thing that seems to be playing out in general in library world work with CRT. Again, the same important caveats apply. LIS work has used CRT to explore a bunch of different library world phenomena, from cataloging to children's librarianship to public library use to academic publishing, and the racial politics embedded in such work is far from uniform, is varied and complex. That said, in spite of its attempts to distance itself from conventional corporate DEI regimes, LIS work with CRT has generally tended to reiterate their core anti-racist logics of diversity, inclusion, and equity, resolving into more or less the same political project as DEI, just with more teeth, with more of a snarl, more of a growl. In keeping with dominant liberal frameworks, racism shows up in such texts as a lack of diversity, as exclusion, as marginalization, as bias, as inequality and inequity. Right? Anti-racism shows up as the move to diversify, to include, and to address disparity within LIS spaces. And racial justice, in turn, shows up as racially representative library spaces, as inclusive library spaces, as institutional and professional recognition. A number of texts, for instance, use CRT as a basis to present racism as ultimately a matter of disparity between the racial makeup of the larger population and the racial makeup of library work. Right, the racial demographics of public library governance bodies, for example, of archival work or of academic librarianship in general. Other texts frame racism as a lack of inclusion within collections and knowledge production, a lack of inclusion in children's literature, for example, scholarly communications, or library collections broadly. CRT provides a way of illuminating the contributing factors to such inequity, with authors illuminating factors like oppressive racial dynamics in the workplace, ineffective recruitment, retention, and advancement initiatives, or dominant histories of library education and librarianship. But the anti-racist logic and vision, the anti-racist framing, right, the ask, the demand ultimately remains the same. It's about ending racial disparity within the institution, achieving racial equity within the profession, within the nation, within capitalism. It's the inclusion of non-white voices into existing library collections, right? It's the alignment of the racial makeup of the library workplace with the society of which it's a part, the elimination of racially toxic microdynamics in the workplace, and the support of non-white professional advancement within existing institutional structures. It is in sum a call for inclusion and hospitability within spaces as we know them, a call that we be recognized by the institutions of racial capitalism, a call that we be proportionally integrated into and allowed to advance within capitalism. Now, in other LIS texts, CRT is, in a sense, deployed to a more limited end. There's less of an emphasis on making an explicit claim in support of a particular anti-racist politics, with critical race theory rather serving as a vehicle for simply establishing that the library world is not race neutral and describing how racism in turn plays out, right? Its details, its dynamics, its outcomes. One author, for example, draws on CRT largely as a means of unpacking and situating their experiences of isolation and other forms of harm in the workplace, as well as their practices of community. Another text uses CRT to frame the articulated experiences of non-white users in relation to specific public library educational programs. Even in texts like these, however, where the authors do not seem to set out to articulate a substantive anti-racist politics, the deployment of CRT is nevertheless virtually always accompanied to some extent by the language of DEI, by the positioning of institutional inclusion and recognition as the horizon of racial justice. Moreover, even as establishing that racism exists and detailing how it plays out is, again, obviously an important starting point, such analysis, as is too often the case with CRT literature more broadly, stops short of a substantive structural critique. That is a meaningful account of why racism persists, of its operation as a sustaining element of how our lives are governed under capitalism. As such, and given the contextual weight of capitalism's authoritative anti-racist politics, such deployments of CRT and LAS tend to circulate in service of the racial liberal story by which racism is recognized as a commonplace system of disproportionate harm directed at non-white communities, but is framed simply as the result of widespread and long-standing miseducation, the widespread legacy of a toxic past, or some other limited phenomena. Taken together, then, it's a body of literature that, in spite of clear desires for a break from existing racial politics, has tended to operate as an extension of the broader historical political project of counterinsurgency, by which anti-racist struggle is detached from anti-capitalist struggle, by which analysis of the racial oppression that shows up in the library world is detached from a deeper reckoning with capitalism, its core dependence on racialized differentiation, hierarchy, and violence, and its inevitable reproduction as such through the mission and normal operations of the library as such, LAS as such. In other words, it's not simply a matter of the questions that have tended to be asked not going far enough. It's about the ways in which the circulation of limited racial politics, that is, racial politics that are specifically circumscribed so as to exclude consideration of political and economic structure, has actively served to extend the very material racialized violence that we're ostensibly fighting against. Now, this is not all that can or should be said about the application of critical race theory in our field. And again, I'm not here to dismiss CRT more broadly, to argue that CRT as a framework, or indeed any project of inclusion to which it is attached, is inevitably complicit, whether it be in the library world or beyond. Nor, again, am I here to dismiss the existing body of CRT literature in our field. Right? The texts and the projects they're a part of are complex, are characterized by far more nuance than I've been able to attend to today, even as there's no shortage of clear evidence within such literature of a genuine desire to make material differences in the lives of folks directly harmed by the structures of racial violence that govern our society. So that much is clear. My discussion of existing literature is rather about the ways in which these specific tendencies I've highlighted can be instructive for all of us interested in confronting these structures, right? It remains critical in the end that we continue to do this work, this work in our field and from within our field, that we continue to give sustained attention to the specific ways in which the racialized dynamics at the heart of structures of exploitation play out in the corners of the world that our lives and work touch. But it's just as important that we be explicit, self-reflective, and self-critical about the stories we are telling, the anti-racist logic we are recirculating, and the interests we are serving in so doing. And so we return to the question that I posed at the start of this talk. If you are drawn to using critical race theory as an analytical lens, then what is the political project you are attaching to it? Are you approaching CRT as a framework that will necessarily take you beyond the liberal anti-racist logics of inclusion and equity that represent status quo library world racial politics? Or are you conceiving of CRT as a way of making DEI work effective, of achieving genuine inclusion and equity within the institution as it exists? Does the political project you attach your work to indeed align with that embedded within the specific CRT texts upon which you're drawing? Or are you indeed strategically deploying a given CRT concept or set of concepts, even as you reshape and resituate it, attaching it to a different set of fundamental assumptions about race and power than those with which it might have originally been associated with? Right? How might we, as individual workers committed to advancing these kinds of conversations, make our answers to these kinds of questions explicit in our work, make our assumptions explicit, make these stories we are telling explicit? If your turn to CRT is indeed simply about achieving inclusion, equity, and recognition within institutions as they currently exist under capitalism, if the political project is indeed about reform of those institutions based on a faith in their mission and their fundamental operations, if it is indeed about equality before the law, as it were, if the dismantling of racism is conceived of as such, and as thus disconnected from the dismantling of the fundamental capitalist political and economic arrangements that govern our society, if this is the political project you are attaching to your work with CRT, then be upfront about that at the very least. If, for example, the goal is recruitment, retention, and advancement towards a more racially proportionate workforce, and if this does not per se include a reckoning with deeper structures of racism and capitalism as they are reproduced through the library as such, then say so. Be explicit about that, about what you are saying and not saying. But what might it look like to collectively extend CRT into a more radical critique, to attach it to an analysis and political project that explicitly account for racial capitalism, that goes beyond not only the rhetorics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but their core logics that indeed altogether disavows diversity, equity, inclusion as the only conceivable horizon of liberation? What if the demand wasn't a more demographically representative profession or collection, wasn't simply the elimination of white privilege, wasn't simply more racially equitable experiences and racially proportionate outcomes in the library world, wasn't simply institutional recognition? Again, to ask these questions is not to suggest that there is no value, for example, to working on representational diversity in children's literature collections, something I think about a lot when choosing silly picture books to read with my kid. It's to suggest rather that it matters how we frame the work we do. We might work to address the racial dynamics of children's collections, for example, even as we explicitly frame that work, not as a project of inclusion under capitalism, but instead as work at a local level, ultimately connected to a project of confronting capitalism's core set of racialized stories about the differential worth and dignity of lives and bodies. I think here, as I do often, of the evocative central question posed by librarian and LIS scholar Yoon-hee Lee, a question addressed in part to those thinking about race and power in the library world. What if we thought of ourselves as workers under racial capitalism? Now, Lee's work doesn't draw on critical race theory as such, and there's a lot more to her work, including a focus in particular on LIS educational curriculum. But her central question, again, what if we thought of ourselves as workers under racial capitalism, points, among other things, to a fundamentally different way of conceiving of the political project that we might attach to critical work on race and power from within our field. Lee highlights the deep problems with thinking about racial justice work simply as a project of developing a diverse and equitable multiracial professional class. Thinking about ourselves instead as workers under racial capitalism means that we frame, among other things, our anti-racist practice as part of a political project undertaken alongside other workers, a political project of confronting the intertwined and mutually reinforcing structures of racism and capitalism, that we reckon with these larger structures as contributions to coalitional struggle from where we are situated, with the operation of the library as such and librarianship as such as formations bound up in larger systems of exploitation by which virtually all our lives are increasingly impoverished and imperiled, if again, at different speeds, in different ways, to different relative degrees. In the end, though, I can't say that I'm especially drawn to CRT as a basis for making sense of and mobilizing such work. Again, this may prompt a discussion about the fact that CRT means different things to different people and it's used in a bunch of different ways. But the more important point to reemphasize for me is that we need to recognize that even as a specific intellectual tradition, CRT is not the be-all and end-all of conceptual frameworks for critical work on race and power in and through our field, right? Critical race theory is not the only avenue for substantive critiques of race and power in LIS, in other words. But for a variety of understandable reasons, we're often in situations where we draw on the closest available frameworks, importing them into our work uncritically as if they are infallible, objective analytical instruments that can be counted on to perform as expected. To the extent that critical race theory is going to continue to be a prominent lens through which library workers make sense of and respond to structures of racialized violence as these are produced in and through the field, it's important that we avoid treating it as infallible as such, that we attend critically and honestly to CRT's historical and contemporary context, its tendencies, its limitations, and its complicities, and the implications of these for our work. Indeed, and I'll end here, regardless of what specific tradition we are drawing on, those of us undertaking any critical race work, any work on race and power in LAS ultimately would do well to foster rigorous debate and principled disagreement about the frameworks we're using, about the stories we're telling, about the political projects we're advancing. Now, granted, there are not many spaces in our field in which it is easy to have these discussions, and it's therefore obviously important to be supportive of folks undertaking this sort of work. However, as Yoon-hee Lee observed in a conversation we had some time ago, the fact that there are so few spaces in our field to talk about such things openly has tended to lead to a lack of substantive debate, a dynamic by which any work on race and power that challenges the myth of library race neutrality is celebrated uncritically. We're just so happy to find other people who are doing this work, who are making time to do this work in spite of the odds against them, and we don't want to interrupt that. However, if we're to continue to build spaces within our field from within which we can contribute to meaningful challenges to the ways in which structures of racialized violence are impoverishing our lives and imperiling our futures, we do well to find ways of supporting one another that involves mutual critique. Likewise, as I suggested earlier, we do well to move beyond the fixation on challenging the idea of race neutrality. It's not that there's no place for this, but if those are the only conversations we're having, if the question of race neutrality and the mere existence of systemic racism is where these conversations start and end, if there's no room for exploration and argument beyond this, then it seems to me that our work is that much easier to contain, to manage, to institutionalize, to neutralize, to position ultimately in service of the same structures of racial capitalist violence from whose other side attacks on libraries and schools are being carried out. And indeed, perhaps the next few days can contribute in some small way to moving beyond such conversations. So thank you so much for listening, for your attention, and I'd be happy to hear any questions or comments that you might have.